My name is Claire Marlowe. I am 29 years old. While my sister Brooke was handed a townhouse in Nashville, a white Lexus RX, and enough money to open a wellness studio that never turned a profit, I worked patient records by day and poured coffee by night just to keep heat in a basement apartment that flooded every time Pittsburgh got more than an inch of rain. My parents called that independence. They said Brooke had vision, and vision needed investment. They said I was practical, steady, the kind of daughter who knew how to make things work. For a long time, I believed them. I believed there was something noble about eating peanut butter for dinner because my second paycheck had gone to student loans. I believed being tired meant I was becoming stronger. That was the lie they wrapped around neglect until it sounded like praise. The night everything changed, I was working a hospital donor reception after an 8-hour shift at the rehab clinic upstairs. My feet were swollen inside shoes I had glued at the heel twice. I was refilling coffee near the dessert table when a man in a gray suit stopped beside my cart. He looked at my name badge, then at my face, like he had been comparing the two in his mind for years. "Did your father ever ask you to sign a care compliance form after your grandmother's memorial?" he asked. The cup in my hand tilted just enough for coffee to spill onto the white linen. I remembered my father's kitchen table, a stack of papers, his finger covering the top half of the page. My mother's hand on my shoulder, telling me family was not something you questioned. The man opened his briefcase and showed me one page bearing Evelyn Porter's seal, my full legal name, and a number large enough to make my throat close. Then he said, "They never told you who your grandmother chose, did they? Before we begin, please subscribe to support the channel. And here is a fun little challenge. Check your phone battery right now. If it is above 12%, comment 1. If it is below 12%, comment 2. Let's see which answer wins today. If you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, you can buy us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Every contribution helps us continue creating more meaningful, emotional, and captivating stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. Now, let's begin the story. I set the coffee pot down before my hand could shake hard enough to drop it. The woman at table 6 lifted her empty cup and gave me that small, impatient smile people use when they think a uniform makes you part of the furniture. The man in the gray suit closed his briefcase slowly, as if he already knew I needed 1 second to breathe. "My name is Miles Corbett," he said. "I represented your grandmother in estate matters for almost 20 years. This was the only place I could reach you without your father being told first." My grandmother's name made the ballroom feel smaller. Evelyn Porter had been gone for 3 months, and my family had treated her death like a checklist. Service arranged, flowers ordered, thank you cards mailed, papers handled. Everything explained before I had the chance to ask a single real question. Miles reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and handed me a thick envelope sealed with a silver clasp. "Do not open this here," he said, "and do not call your parents tonight." I looked down at the envelope, then back at him. "What is this?" My voice sounded calm, which surprised me. Inside, I felt like the floor had shifted an inch. Miles did not soften the way people do when they are about to make bad news easier. He only said, "The first thing your grandmother wanted you to have. The first thing you should have received years ago." Across the room, the hospital foundation director was thanking donors for supporting compassionate care, and everyone clapped like kindness had just been successfully purchased. Miles lowered his voice. "If anyone in your family asks you to sign anything this week, say no. If your father says it is routine, say no. If your mother cries, still say no." That was the first moment I felt afraid not of him, but of how accurately he knew the shape of my family. My father explained. My mother softened, Brooke dismissed. And somehow, by the end, I was always the one apologizing for needing a minute to think. I finished the reception on instinct. I smiled when people asked for cream. I cleared plates. I thanked donors whose watches cost more than my car. At 11:30, I changed in the restroom, tucked the envelope inside my coat, and took the bus to the diner. I was not supposed to work that shift originally. I had picked it up because my landlord had raised the rent again, and my car had failed inspection the week before. For 6 hours, the envelope sat in my locker between my spare socks and a granola bar. Every time I passed the back hallway, I felt it waiting for me. I told myself I would open it after the rush. Then, after sunrise. The truth was, I was afraid one envelope could make my whole life unrecognizable. By the time I got home, my hands smelled like coffee, sanitizer, and fryer oil, and I still could not bring myself to break the seal. 72 hours later, my phone started lighting up before breakfast. My father called at 8:06. My mother called at 8:09. Brooke texted at 8:12. What did you do? Then the house phone rang, a number I had not seen in months. When I answered, my father did not ask if I was okay. My mother did not say good morning. He only said, "Claire, come home. Your sister could lose everything." And for the first time in my life, they needed me, not because I was their daughter, but because I had become the one signature they could no longer control. Before I tell you what happened after that call, you need to understand why my first instinct was still to go. People judge that part until they have lived inside a family where love is measured by how little trouble you cause. In our house, Brooke was the daughter with promise. I was the daughter with stamina. She was bright, expressive, impossible to ignore. I was useful. There is a difference, and my parents taught it to me so gently that for years I mistook it for affection. When Brooke walked into a room, my mother adjusted the lighting around her. When I walked in, she handed me something to carry. Brooke's mistakes were called growing pains. Mine were called poor planning. If Brooke quit piano, it meant she was discovering herself. If I asked to stop babysitting a neighbor's kids so I could study, I was reminded that dependable people did not make excuses. Every family has a budget, but ours only seemed to become strict when my name came up. My father liked to say we were different kinds of gifted. Brooke had vision, I had discipline. It sounded balanced until you noticed only one of those gifts came with checks attached. At Brooke's college graduation, my parents rented the back room of an Italian restaurant with white tablecloths and a man playing Sinatra near the bar. There were flower arrangements, a photographer, and a cake with gold lettering. My father made a toast about investing in people brave enough to dream. Then he handed Brooke the keys to a white Lexus RX with a red bow taped to the hood. My mother cried into a napkin and posted 6 photos before dessert. By the time I finished my healthcare administration program at 24, we went to a chain restaurant off the interstate because my mother had a coupon that expired that weekend. Brooke did not come. She sent a text with 3 bee emojis and wrote, "Proud of you, little worker bee." I stared at that message in the parking lot and told myself it was cute. That was how trained I was. I could sand the insult down until it looked like love. The summer I was offered a low-paid internship with a hospital operations team in Harrisburg. I begged my parents for help with temporary housing. My father said I needed to be realistic. My mother said Brooke's leadership retreat had already been paid for, and deposits were non-refundable. That retreat cost $42,700. I knew because Brooke left the brochure on the kitchen counter, circled in pink marker. That same week, I picked up closing shifts at the diner and slept in my car between jobs because driving home would have cost too much gas. The worst part was not that they helped her and left me tired. The worst part was that they made my exhaustion sound noble. They did not have to call me less loved. They only had to call me stronger. And I carried what they refused to give me. That was why, when my father said Brooke could lose everything, some old obedient part of me still reached for my keys, not because I trusted them, because I had been raised to answer when Brooke's life became an emergency. My grandmother, Evelyn Porter, was the only person in my family who never confused quiet with empty. She had a way of looking at me that made lying to myself difficult. When I was 17, I spent a summer helping at the first Porter Haven facility, the small brick one outside Greensburg with 12 beds, a sunroom full of tired plants, and a hallway that always smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and oatmeal. My parents called it volunteer work, Brooke called it sweet. Evelyn called it training, though I did not understand that then. She had built Porter Haven after my grandfather died in a facility where nobody noticed he had stopped eating until his wedding ring slid loose on his finger. Evelyn had been a night nurse before she was anything else, and grief did not make her soft. It made her precise. She sold the house they had shared for 31 years, borrowed against everything she owned, and opened a care home where no resident would be treated like a room number. By the time I was old enough to organize activity logs and supply forms for her, Porter Haven had grown across 2 states, but Evelyn still checked the dinner trays herself. I remember one Thursday evening more clearly than some birthdays. A resident named Mrs. Dallow had refused dinner 3 weeks in a row. The aides said she was difficult, the kitchen said she was picky, the activity log said poor appetite, which was the kind of phrase that made a human being disappear inside polite language. I watched her sit near the window with her cardigan buttoned wrong, staring at the phone on the wall beside the nurse's station. No one else seemed to notice that she only skipped dinner on Thursdays. I asked Nora Bell about it. Nora was the head nurse then, 60-something, with silver hair pinned so tightly it looked like it could survive a hurricane. She looked at Mrs. Dallow, then at me, and said, "Her son used to call on Thursdays." That was all. One sentence. Enough to make the whole room change shape. That night, I moved the volunteer choir practice from Wednesday to Thursday and asked the kitchen to serve soup in the sunroom instead of the dining hall. Mrs. Dallow did not eat much at first, but she stayed. The next Thursday, she finished half a bowl. Evelyn found me afterward in the supply closet, restocking gloves because I did not know where else to put my hands when someone praised me. She stood in the doorway with her cane, watching like she had seen more than I meant to show. "Good care," she said, "is noticing who disappears quietly." Then she handed me a stack of invoices and asked what I noticed. Not because she expected me to know, because she expected me to learn. My father gave instructions. My mother gave assignments. Brooke gave commentary. Evelyn gave me room to think. That was why the envelope from Miles frightened me more than any bill collector ever had. If Evelyn had left me something, it was not because she felt sorry for me. Evelyn did not reward suffering. She trusted attention. She was not sentimental with responsibility. And she did not believe blood made someone worthy. Brooke could give a beautiful speech about compassion. Evelyn knew compassion was what you did after the room emptied and nobody was taking pictures. At the memorial, Brooke stood at the podium in a black dress and spoke about legacy, dignity, and women leading with heart. People dabbed their eyes. My mother squeezed my father's hand as if they had raised the daughter speaking up there all by themselves. I stood near the back of the fellowship hall, refilling paper cups with lemonade for the old residents who had come in wheelchairs and church vans. Nora Bell caught my eye once from across the room. She did not smile. She just nodded, like we were the only 2 people there who knew grief was not measured by who held the microphone. For years, I thought Evelyn had simply loved me in a quieter way. I thought the summer at Porter Haven was a memory, not a map. I thought her sentence about disappearing quietly was something to keep in my heart when work got hard. I did not know she had written it down. I did not know she had built legal walls around it. And I did not know my parents had spent years making sure I never found the door. 8 years before Miles stopped me beside that catering cart, Evelyn had her first stroke. It was not the kind that took her voice completely, but it stole enough strength from one side of her body that everyone around her began speaking as if she had already left the room. My father called it a transition period. My mother called it a family adjustment. Brooke called it stressful, and booked a weekend in Charleston to clear her head. I was 21, carrying textbooks in my trunk and working dinner shifts at the diner, whenever the clinic schedule allowed. A week after Evelyn was moved into rehab, my father asked me to come by the house before work. He did not say please. Martin Marlowe had a way of making requests sound like calendar entries already approved by someone more important than you. My checking account had $43 until Friday, and the diner manager had already warned me not to be late again. I almost said I could not make it. Then my mother texted, It will only take a minute, honey. Your father needs your help with some temporary Porter Haven paperwork while Grandma is recovering. Their kitchen smelled like lemon polish and Elaine's chicken casserole, the kind she made when she wanted the house to feel warmer than it was. Brooke sat at the island in workout clothes too clean for exercise, scrolling through her phone and sipping cucumber water. My father had arranged a stack of papers beside a blue pen. Not in the dining room, where serious things happened. Not in his office, where questions belonged. In the kitchen, beside a casserole dish, as if legal documents became harmless when placed near potholders. Porter Haven is in transition, he said, tapping the top page. There are compliance forms that need signatures, so operations do not get interrupted while your grandmother is recovering. I looked at the packet. It was thicker than I expected. Should I read it first? I asked. My father gave a small laugh, not cruel enough to challenge, just dismissive enough to make me feel childish. You can, but it is standard regulatory language. You will give yourself a headache. My mother came behind me and rested both hands on my shoulders. This is not the time to make things harder for Grandma. That was how they did it. Not with force. With atmosphere. My father made confusion feel stupid. My mother made caution feel unkind. Brooke did not even look up when she said, "Claire, just sign it. Some of us have real things tomorrow." I remember the heat climbing into my face, not because I was angry, but because I was embarrassed for slowing the room down. So, I sat. My father turned the pages quickly, covering sections with his palm as he pointed to the lines. Initial here, sign here, date there. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that looked like betrayal. I signed because daughters are taught to recognize their father's hand before they can recognize a trap. I signed because my mother's fingers squeezed my shoulders every time I hesitated. I signed because Brooke sighed like my caution was another bill everyone else had to pay. When it was done, my father squared the papers by tapping them against the counter. He did not thank me. He only said, "See, this is why we can count on you." At the time, I thought he meant I was trustworthy. Later, I understood he meant I was easy. What I did not see was the page behind the page. The first sheet had been exactly what he said it was, a care compliance acknowledgement. Beneath it was a disclosure waiver, stating I had been informed of the Porter Legacy Care Trust and understood all beneficiary rights. Another page authorized temporary trustees to approve development distributions on my behalf. Another described me as unwilling to assume active control when I came of age. At the bottom, my signature sat obediently where my father had placed it. Elaine's name appeared as witness. Grant Ellison's initials were printed in the corner as preparer. I would not learn any of that until years later, in a conference room with Miles Corbett, watching my face as I read the copies. But some part of me must have known the kitchen had swallowed something that night. When I left, Brooke was laughing at a video on her phone. My mother was covering the casserole with foil, and my father had already slid the folder into his leather briefcase. Outside, rain turned the driveway black. I sat in my car with the engine off, staring at the house where I had learned to be useful, and felt ashamed for not knowing why I wanted to cry. Back in my apartment, the morning after Miles found me at the reception, I finally opened his envelope. I had slept less than 2 hours, still wearing the diner smell in my hair because I had been too tired to shower. I sat at my small kitchen table and watched weak winter light come through the blinds. My hands were steady until they were not. Inside were copies, not originals, each page clipped in order, each one stamped and dated like somebody had been waiting years for the truth to become official enough to hurt. The first document was a certified section of the Porter Legacy Care Trust. I read my name once, then again, because it looked wrong sitting beside words like primary beneficiary and controlling interest. According to the document, when I turned 29, I was supposed to receive 54% voting control of Porter Haven communities, along with income rights from 4 assisted living properties in Pennsylvania and Ohio. I stared at the page until the numbers stopped being numbers and became rent. I could not pay. Dental work I had postponed, and winters I had spent sleeping in 2 sweaters. Miles had written one note in blue ink across the top of the next page. Call me before you call anyone else. So I did. He answered on the second ring, as if he had been sitting beside the phone. Now you understand why I couldn't explain it in a ballroom, he said. I asked him the only question that mattered. If this is real, why have I been broke my entire adult life? There was a pause long enough for me to hear a truck pass outside my apartment. Then he said, because the people appointed to protect it treated access like ownership. He asked me to meet him somewhere private. 2 hours later, I sat across from him in a borrowed conference room above a medical billing office downtown, a place he chose because no one in my father's circle had any reason to look there. The air smelled like printer toner and old carpet. Miles placed more folders on the table, but he did not push them toward me all at once. He opened them slowly, one layer at a time, like he understood that truth could still injure you, even when it came to set you free. My grandmother had named Martin and Elaine temporary trustees only until I became old enough to assume control. Their authority was narrow: education, housing, healthcare, reasonable professional development. For me, not for the family, not for Brooke, not for whatever my father decided sounded responsible. Then Miles gave me Evelyn's letter. The paper was cream-colored, folded once, with my name written in her sharp, slanted handwriting. She wrote that the person entrusted with Porterhaven had to understand quiet suffering before managing other people's comfort. Evelyn wrote that care was not a business model unless dignity came first, and that Porterhaven needed a steward, not a performer. Brooke had been left a separate conditional gift, one she could claim only after 5 years of real work in community care or operations. My sister had done neither. I read that line 3 times. Not because it surprised me, but because for once, someone had written the truth without apologizing for it. Miles folded his hands on the table and said, "Claire, the trust exists. The question now is where the money went." Miles did not introduce June Alvarez like a consultant. He introduced her like a surgeon. She was already in the room when I arrived the next afternoon, a woman in her early 40s with dark hair pulled back, square glasses, and a laptop covered in color-coded tabs. She did not offer comfort. She offered precision. "I am going to show you the distributions first," she said. "Then I am going to show you where they landed." Something about that sentence made my stomach tighten. Money sounded clean until someone explained the trail it left behind. The first number was $412,600. That was what had left the Porter Legacy Care Trust in my name over 7 years. June clicked once, and a second number appeared beneath it. $18,900. That was what could be tied directly to me. A semester balance, 2 dental payments, a reimbursement for a medical bill my mother had once made me pay back in installments. The rest had been described in language so polished it almost looked innocent. Beneficiary housing transition, transportation for care, leadership development, professional advancement pilot, stabilization support. Then June began matching the phrases to real things. Beneficiary housing transition was $96,000 toward Brooke's Nashville townhouse. Transportation for care leadership development was the white Lexus. Professional advancement pilot was $131,000 wired into Brooke's wellness studio 2 months before its grand opening. A Sedona retreat had been coded as continuing education. A public relations package was labeled community outreach. Even Brooke's credit card debt, after the studio missed payroll, had been buried under stabilization support. I sat there watching my name turn into rooms I had never slept in, wheels I had never driven, and photographs I had been expected to like online. I thought of the week my car failed inspection, and I took 3 buses to the clinic before sunrise. I thought of Brooke posting a ribbon-cutting photo with my mother beside her, both of them smiling under a banner that said "Women Built to Lead." I thought of the winter I kept my oven door open, after baking potatoes, because the apartment heat had gone out again. Those memories did not arrive like sadness. They arrived like witnesses, one after another, standing up inside me with dates, amounts, and faces. June's voice softened only once. "Claire, These were not accounting mistakes. Then she opened an email thread. It was from Brooke to Grant Ellison, copied to my father. The subject line read, Nashville timing. I remember that because it sounded so ordinary, like a travel plan. Brooke had written, if Claire still does not know about the care trust, use the property income. Mom says Dad can make it look like development support. For several seconds, I could not understand the sentence as English. I understood every word. I just could not make them belong to my sister. Brooke had hugged me at Christmas wearing perfume I could never afford, and told me she admired my work ethic. She had called me her grounded little sister during interviews. She had once stood in my apartment doorway, looked at the space heater by my bed, and said, "You're so resilient, Claire. I could never live like this." Now I knew why she never had to. My sister had not accidentally lived better than me. She had lived better because she knew I did not know. And that was the moment my grief stopped asking for an explanation and became something colder. Miles let the silence stay long enough for me to feel the shape of it. He did not rush to fill it with comfort, and I was grateful for that. Comfort would have felt insulting right then. June closed the email thread, but left the numbers on the screen, as if she understood I needed to look at them until my mind stopped trying to protect me. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the old lights overhead. Finally, Miles said, there is a way to stop further movement of the funds, but it has to come from you. He explained the petition slowly. Emergency freeze. Full accounting. Suspension of trustee authority. Preservation of records. Words I had heard only on legal shows suddenly had my name attached to them. If I authorized it, my parents would be notified. Grant would know the records were being examined. Brooke's studio accounts could be restricted if trust money had been used to keep them alive. Porter Haven's board would have to acknowledge that my voting control had matured and that the proxy filed under my name was being challenged. Nothing about it sounded clean. Everything about it sounded necessary. What happens if I do nothing? I asked. I hated how small my voice sounded. June looked at Miles, but he did not let her answer for him. Then your father and Grant keep control long enough to move what they can, he said. Your mother keeps calling it family. Your sister keeps what was bought. And everyone learns that your silence is still the cheapest protection they have. That sentence did not make me brave. It made me honest. I was not ready. I was just more afraid of staying useful than I was of becoming difficult. Miles slid the authorization forms across the table. The paper made a soft sound against the wood, and for one terrible second I was back in my parents' kitchen at 21, watching my father's hand cover what he did not want me to read. My throat tightened. Miles noticed and pulled his hands away from the documents. Take your time, he said. Ask every question. Read every line. Nobody in this room benefits from you being rushed. So I read. I read the headings first, then the paragraphs beneath them. I asked what trustee suspension meant. I asked what records preservation required. I asked whether the court freeze would hurt residents or employees. June explained that ordinary operating expenses could continue, but unusual transfers would be blocked. Miles explained that the point was not to punish Porter Haven. The point was to stop people from using it as a hiding place. For the first time in years, a room full of paperwork did not make me feel stupid. It made me feel awake. I signed my name at the bottom, only after I understood what it meant. Then I dated it, asked for copies, and put them in the folder myself. No one touched my shoulder. No one sighed. No one told me I was making things harder for the family. The first time I signed, I had been trying to be a good daughter. The second time, I was trying to stop being an easy victim. Miles took the folder and said the petition would be filed before noon the next day. That night, I went to the diner because rent was still rent, even when your life had split open. Tessa Whitlock was wiping down the counter when I came in. She looked at my face and did not ask for details. She just poured me coffee, slid it across the counter, and said, "Whatever it is, don't let them make you apologize for finding out." I carried that sentence with me through the rest of my shift. By morning, the emergency petition was in motion. By Monday, my phone would not stop ringing. By Monday morning, The petition had done what Miles said it would do. It did not explode, it locked. The court issued a temporary freeze on unusual trust distributions, ordered preservation of records, and suspended Martin and Elaine's authority pending review. Grant Ellison was instructed not to approve transfers outside ordinary operations. Brooke's studio account, the one June had traced trust money into, was restricted before payroll cleared. At 8:06, my father called. At 8:09, my mother called. At 8:12, Brooke sent the same 3 words again. What did you do? I watched the screen light up from my desk at the clinic, while patients checked in 10 feet away with walkers, folders, and paper insurance cards. The normal world kept moving. A man asked where radiology was. A woman needed help finding her Medicare supplement number. I answered both questions with a voice that sounded almost steady. Then the house phone number appeared. I stepped into the supply room between shelves of gloves and wound care pads and answered on speaker because Miles had told me never to take their calls alone again. My father spoke first. Claire, this has gone far enough. Not hello, not are you all right, just control, dressed as concern. My mother was crying somewhere near the receiver. Honey, whatever that lawyer showed you, he doesn't understand our family. Brooke grabbed the phone next. My studio has staff depending on me. Do you even realize what you're doing? For a second, the old reflex rose in me. Calm them down. Apologize. Make it smaller. Then I looked at the boxes of medical gloves stacked in front of me and remembered how many times my name had been used to cover their mess. What documents do you need me to sign? I asked. The line went quiet. My father recovered first. A temporary authorization, just until this misunderstanding is resolved. You come home, we handle it privately, and no one else gets hurt. That was how he always said it. Privately meant where he could stand over the table. Misunderstanding meant I was not supposed to use the correct word yet. My mother whispered, Please, Claire, your sister could lose everything. I closed my eyes. She did not lose everything, I said. She found out who had been paying for it. Brooke started shouting then, but her voice sounded far away. My father said Miles was poisoning me. My mother said Evelyn would hate seeing us divided. I let them finish because for once, their panic was not my assignment. I will come home tomorrow, I said. Brooke will be there. No papers will be put in front of me unless my attorney sees them first. And I am not signing anything. My father inhaled sharply, like disobedience had made a sound. Then I ended the call before they could teach me guilt in a new language. The next afternoon, I parked 2 blocks from my parents' house, because Miles was parked there first. He sat in his black sedan with a legal pad on his knee, and his phone face up on the console. You do not have to convince them, he said through the open window. You only have to state the record. I nodded like I understood, but my hands were cold around the folder. Before I walked up the street, Tessa's message came through. Don't let them make you apologize for finding out. I read it twice, then put my phone in my pocket. The living room looked exactly the way it always had, which made everything worse. Brooke's framed magazine feature sat on the mantel where my graduation photo had never been. Elaine had set out coffee and lemon bars, as if sugar could soften fraud. My father sat in his armchair with a stack of papers beside him, though I had warned him not to. Brooke stood near the window in a white blazer, arms folded, looking less frightened than offended. I did not sit until my father moved the papers to the side table. I am not here to debate feelings, I said, opening my folder. I am here because $412,600 left a trust in my name, and I received $18,900. My mother flinched, as if numbers were vulgar. My father's jaw tightened. Brooke rolled her eyes, but only until I placed the first summary on the coffee table. $96,000 toward the Nashville townhouse, $58,400 for the Lexus, $131,000 for the studio, $42,700 for Sedona, all described as support for me. My mother reached for a tissue. We used the money for the family. I looked at her hands, the same hands that had rested on my shoulders while I signed. The trust did not say family. It said me. My father leaned forward. Legal language is not the same as intention. Your grandmother wanted Brooke protected too. Then why did she put conditions on Brooke's gift? I asked. No one answered. Brooke laughed once, thin and sharp. You always wanted what I had. I slid the printed email across the table. No, Brooke. I wanted to know why my name was paying for it. The color left her face before she touched the page. My father struck the arm of his chair. Enough. You are tearing this family apart over money. For the first time, his volume did not move me. No, I said. You tore it apart when you decided one daughter's exhaustion could fund the other daughter's image. Elaine whispered that I was humiliating them. I told her humiliation was being called resilient by people who knew exactly why you had to be. Then I gave them Miles's terms: resign as trustees, cooperate with the audit, return what remained, and correct every false statement they had made. My father stared at me like I had walked into his house wearing someone else's face. You think you can come in here and take everything? I closed the folder. I am asking you to return what you took. Brooke said her staff would suffer. I told her the employees were not responsible for her lies, and legitimate wages would be reviewed separately. That seemed to anger her more than losing the money. My mother began to cry harder, but this time I did not reach for her. I stood up, looked at the three of them, and said, "You have 72 hours. Then I walked out before guilt could find another name. They did not take the 72 hours. They used them. By midnight, Brooke had posted a long statement about betrayal, jealousy, and women being punished for succeeding. My mother sent private messages to relatives, saying I was confused and being influenced by a lawyer who wanted control of Evelyn's legacy. My father called 3 board members before breakfast and described me as unstable, inexperienced, and hostile to Porter Haven's mission. Grant Ellison followed with a memo warning that my sudden involvement could create operational risk. It was polished. It was calm. It was exactly how panic sounds when written by a man with a title. The emergency board meeting began Thursday at 9. Porter Haven's headquarters sat behind one of the assisted living buildings, a brick office with framed photos of residents lining the hallway. I walked in beside Miles and June, holding a folder that felt heavier than paper. Martin was already seated near the head of the conference table. Elaine sat beside him, eyes red but dry now. Grant stood by the screen in a navy suit, arranging his notes like he still believed the room belonged to him. Brooke tried to enter behind them, calling herself a family stakeholder. The general counsel asked her to wait in the lobby. June spoke for almost 2 hours. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She matched distribution dates to invoices, invoices to bank records, and bank records to assets that had never benefited me. The townhouse, the vehicle, the studio, the retreat, the public relations package. Then she showed the changed mailing address, the proxy filed under my name, and the internal memos Grant had prepared to make theft look like planning. Every label my family had hidden behind became a number, a date, and a signature. Grant leaned forward when June finished. These were strategic allocations designed to protect continuity, he said. His voice was smooth enough to make dishonesty sound bored. Then June opened the last file. Less than an hour after the court freeze was issued, Grant had attempted to move $175,000 into Harborline Consulting Group. The transfer failed. Harborline, June explained, was registered through a relative of Grant's wife. For the first time, all morning, Grant had nothing ready to say. Martin stared at the screen. Elaine looked down at her hands. Miles submitted the certified trust, and the court order suspending the proxy. The general counsel confirmed what my grandmother had written years before. My voting control had matured. 54%. The room turned toward me, and I understood why my parents had kept me tired. A tired woman does not walk into boardrooms. A tired woman signs where she is told. My father said, "You have no idea how to run this company." I looked at the residents' photos on the wall. That is why I am appointing people who do. My first vote removed Grant as CFO pending investigation. My second suspended Martin and Elaine from any trustee-related authority connected to Porter Haven. My third created an independent finance committee and a resident care oversight panel, with Nora Bell invited to serve on it. No speech, no revenge performance. Just motions, seconds, and votes. Each one passed. When it was over, my father looked at me like I had become a stranger. Maybe I had. Or maybe, for the first time, I had stopped being the daughter he could afford to underestimate. The court hearing 2 weeks later did not feel like victory. It felt like weather clearing after a storm had already taken the roof. Martin and Elaine were permanently removed from trustee authority and ordered to cooperate with full restitution, including lost growth and legal costs. Liens were placed on their vacation cabin and investment accounts. Brooke had 60 days to repay the trust-funded equity in the townhouse or sell it. She sold it. The Lexus was surrendered before the end of the month. Her studio closed quietly, without a ribbon, without a photographer, without a speech. Grant Ellison's name disappeared from Porter Haven's website before lunch the day the civil complaint was filed. Later, Miles told me the professional board had opened its own review. I did not ask for details I did not need. Elaine resigned from the church charity committee after Reverend Paul Keene received the correction statement she had signed. My mother had spent years being praised for compassion in public, while helping erase her own daughter in private. Watching that image crack did not make me happy. It only made the room honest. I paid off my student loans and moved out of the basement apartment into a small rental with working heat and 2 maple trees outside the kitchen window. I did not buy anything dramatic. For a while, I slept with the thermostat set higher than necessary just because I could. Porter Haven offered me the chief executive role, but I refused it. Authority was not the same as wisdom. I accepted board chair instead, started governance training, and spent Fridays sitting with nurses, aides, kitchen staff, and residents who knew exactly which leaders only visited when cameras were nearby. The first program I approved was the Evelyn Porter Night Shift Education Fund for caregivers studying nursing, healthcare administration, or social work while working full-time. Nora Bell agreed to serve on the Resident Care Oversight Panel. At our first meeting, she looked at the budget, then at me, and said, "Your grandmother would like that you fixed the books without forgetting the people inside them." That was the closest I came to crying in public. Not because I had won, but because something Evelyn planted had survived all the years my family tried to bury it. My father sent 3 letters. The first blamed Grant, the second blamed pressure, the third had one honest sentence. "I knew it was yours, and I believed Brooke deserved more protection." I kept that one because it named the wound clearly. My mother asked to meet after she corrected the story with our relatives. "We talk sometimes now. We are not close. That is not a tragedy I am required to repair alone." Brooke texted once, "You ruined my life." I answered, "A life built from someone else's stolen chances was never yours to keep." People call what I did revenge, but revenge sounds louder than it was. I read documents. I asked questions. I stopped signing what I did not understand. I let evidence enter the rooms where my parents' charm had always protected them. For years, they called my exhaustion independence, because neglect sounds cruel when you name it correctly. But once the truth was exposed, I stopped confusing being useful with being loved. So tell me, if the people who called your suffering strength suddenly needed your signature to save themselves, would you give it back? Or would you let the truth finish what it started? What I learned from all of this is that love should never require you to disappear. Family is supposed to be the place where your tiredness is noticed, not the place where it is used. For years, I thought being strong meant needing less, asking less, expecting less. I thought resilience meant carrying pain quietly, so nobody else had to feel uncomfortable. But sometimes what people call your strength is just the name they give to the weight they never intended to help you carry. There is a kind of hurt that does not look dramatic from the outside. It looks like another shift, another bill paid late, Another holiday where you smile through a comment that cuts deeper than anyone realizes. It looks like being praised for being easy, while someone else is protected from every consequence. And because it happens slowly, you start to believe it is normal. You start to believe love is something you earn by staying useful. But real love does not need you exhausted to prove you are worthy. Real family does not hide behind sacrifice when what they really mean is control. The people who love you may make mistakes, but they do not build their comfort from your silence. They do not call your suffering character while spending your future on someone else. Healing did not begin for me when the court ruled in my favor. It began the moment I stopped arguing with the truth. It began when I read the papers, when I asked questions, when I stopped handing people my trust just because they shared my blood. Boundaries did not make me cruel, they made me honest. And honesty gave me back the part of myself I had been trained to abandon. So, if this story reaches someone who has been called selfish for finally standing up, I hope you remember this. You are allowed to protect what is yours. Your peace, your future, your dignity, your name. Being needed is not the same as being loved, and being quiet is not the same as agreeing. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been expected to stay strong for people who never protected you?